Russia says it reserves the right to retaliate after Britain imposes sanctions against individuals over alleged human rights abuses. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman slammed the sanctions as unfounded and politically charged. Maria Zakharova warned that punitive measures will have a negative impact on ties between the two countries. On Thursday, the UAE imposed travel bans and asset freezes on 3 Russian individuals. It accused them of severe human rights violations in Chechnya. Ban was part of a coordinated move with the U.S. Washington sanctions target a number of Russian individuals and firms over the same allegations. Russia said U.S. measures will deepen a crisis in bilateral ties. Joining us out of Bristol now for more on the story is Tony Gosling, investigative journalist. Hello, Tony. Always a pleasure to have you on Press TV, get your perspective on things. Now, the same exact countries that are stopping the ICC from conducting probes on alleged war crimes in Afghanistan, and these are deaths, not the worst of all human rights violations. You stop investigations into those, and then you're sanctioning people for much less alleged human rights violations. Your thoughts how that even works?
Well, this is another provocation. It's fascinating to see. I mean, the idea is really the West is trying to constantly keep the initiative in bringing everybody down. That is to say, in taking punitive moves which are not justified. So what they're trying to do is provoke a reaction from Putin and Russia to sanction other British people and this sort of thing. But actually, the Russians are very sensible and level-headed about this. And although they have said that this is not going to be good for UK-Russia relations, they haven't done a sort of tit for tat, which is maybe what the British and Americans wanted. I think we're going to see most of the observers I've spoken to more anti-Russia tactics under Biden than there were under Trump. Assuming that Biden takes over at the end of January, I think the British and the Americans also, because of Brexit, are working much, much more closely together.
Right. And do you think, we're seeing Donald Trump on his way out. We saw, basically a lot of sanctioning going back and forth between the Trump administration and Moscow. And now we're seeing kind of the same thing. What do you think the current policy and climate is when it comes to sanctions out of Washington and London toward Moscow?
Well, there's a very good reason for these sanctions. Most of them are taking place under the various Magnitsky Acts, which are there for a specific purpose. The idea is to have a chilling effect on trade and relations, because although we've just seen these 3 people sanctioned today, the Russians sanctioned by the British, what happens is, and people don't understand this is no part of the commentary that you'll get in the UK, is that all Russians then look at what's happened to these people and they are very careful about, for example, travelling to the UK. So that means that they can sanction people, they can take away their visas, etc., even whilst they're travelling in Europe or in the UK. So that means that it's much less likely that Russians are going to be coming to London to do trade visits, for example, to cut deals, whether it's to do with energy, this sort of thing, which the Russians are very, very good at supplying cheap energy, as we know. And that many of those individuals will be having to think twice before they come to London, knowing that they could be sanctioned in a similar way. So it's having a massive chilling effect, and London is making all the running. I would say that probably this is at the behest of the United States, and that whether it's Trump or Biden in charge, actually the US deep state is becoming much more powerful in Britain. Just for example, recently I was visiting one of the defence establishments here in Britain, and who should I see on the reception but a lovely lady from Wisconsin. The Americans are all over Britain now, and particularly in the defence sector they're coming in more and more since Brexit, but that doesn't mean to say that's a bad thing. We were getting far too much in bed with with Brussels, and obviously Britain is never going to be all entirely on its own. But this is, I think, mainly the US behind these sanctions, the British and Boris Johnson, who, let's face it, has been a very weak Prime Minister in standing up to the United States. Boris Johnson just goes along with it.
And it's funny you should say that. To your point, Tony, the fact that there may be outside pressure involved here is that there are a lot of Russians that actually do have a lot of interest in the billions, a lot of luxurious properties, a lot of business interests. possibly even per capita more so in the UK than they do in the US.
Yes, definitely, particularly in London. And we've seen that in a negative way as well, because quite a lot of the oligarchs who were actually the ones, the top oligarchs like Berezovsky, who's dead now, but his friends were actually behind the Chechen wars that the British are blaming these Russians for. So it's very cheeky of the British to have a go at the Russians for this, since it was mostly the oligarchs that Vladimir Putin kicked out in the noughties after the year 2000 when he became president, and NATO that were actually behind those Chechen wars. So really what they're doing is sanctioning people for something that they themselves have done. And it's not obviously going to go down very well in Moscow, but I'm afraid the British are quite good at these sorts of provocations, and the Russians are also rather good at turning the other cheek and saying, well, the British are just being silly, they're cutting off their own nose to spite their face, and waiting and maybe having some sort of retribution in the future, but taking it on the chin.
All right, bud, stay safe. Always a pleasure to have you on out of Bristol. It was Tony Gosling there joining us.